He freed a lion trapped under a fallen tree. Minutes later, the lion's pride surrounded him. The storm had come in the night like a living thing, rolling over the Sabi sands with a rage that rattled windows and bent ancient trees to its will. Lightning split the sky into white veins, thunder shook the ground, and rain fell so hard it turned dusty tracks into twisting ribbons of mud. By dawn, the worst of it had passed, leaving behind a landscape that felt raw and exposed, as if the whole wilderness had been peeled back and washed clean. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and crushed leaves, and a low mist clung to the depressions in the land, curling around thorn bushes and termite mounds like ghostly fingers. At the small ranger station on the edge of the reserve, a single light burned in the office, casting a rectangle of warm yellow onto the damp veranda. Inside, sitting alone with a steaming mug of rooibos tea, was a man whose life had been woven into this place for longer than most of the younger rangers had been alive. His name was Samuel Kumalo, though most simply called him Sam. At 63, Sam moved more slowly than he once had, with a stiffness in his hips that made early mornings a negotiation with his own body. His hair had thinned and turned the color of storm clouds, and deep lines carved his face in a way that made him look permanently thoughtful, even when he was quietly amused. He was not a man of many words, but those who worked with him knew that when he spoke, you listened, because his voice carried the weight of decades spent reading tracks in the dust, listening to the breathing of sleeping elephants and watching lions under 1,000 different skies. The radio on the desk crackled with static, then settled into silence again. Power had flickered in and out all night. Sam wrapped his hands around his mug, letting the heat soak into his fingers, and listened to the world outside as it began to wake. A francolin called sharply from somewhere near the water tank, its alarmed clucking bouncing off the damp walls. Frogs, emboldened by the flooding puddles, croaked noisily in the roadside ditch. And, far off, barely audible under the sigh of the wind through the wet trees, came the low, distant grumble of lions returning to their favorite resting spots after a long, stormy hunt. Those lions were as familiar to him as old neighbors. He knew their territories, their feuds, their dynasties. There was one male in particular he had watched for years, a large, dark-maned lion whose presence shifted the air whenever he appeared. The younger rangers called him Inkosi, the chief, for his size and the way he walked as if the ground itself belonged to him. Sam had seen him rise from scrappy young outsider to dominant male of one of the largest prides in the area, seen his mane thicken and darken, seen scars appear and fade along his face and shoulders like lines in some ancient story. In the early days, Sam had watched him from a distance, noting his habits. In later years, there were moments, brief, quiet ones, when the lion would stand in the dust road in front of the Land Cruiser, staring up at Sam with a steady, unhurried gaze before stepping aside to let the vehicle pass. They did not have a relationship in any human sense, but they knew each other. That was enough. The phone on the wall rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was the night patrol team, checking in late because of the storm. Their voices were tired, a little rattled. Trees down across the southern access road, a washed-out section near the river crossing. And one more thing, they said, almost as an afterthought, a thread of concern sliding into their tone. "We heard roaring near the fallen Marula by the eastern ridge," the younger ranger explained. "It sounded wrong, not like usual. Short bursts, then silence. Might be nothing. Might be something caught." Sam felt a small knot tighten in his chest. He knew that old Marula. It stood on a slight rise not far from a cluster of rocks where the lions liked to rest on hot afternoons. If it had fallen in the storm and something had been sheltering beneath it. "I'll check it out," he said simply. "You boys go get some sleep." He hung up, finished his tea in one long swallow, and stepped out into the cool morning. The sky was pale and washed out, still carrying the memory of lightning. The ground sucked at his boots with each step as he walked to the Land Cruiser, its body streaked with dried mud from weeks of patrols. He checked his gear more from habit than fear. Radio, first aid kit, a coil of rope, the small metal box of veterinary tools they kept for emergencies. He paused for a second, his hand resting on the box, feeling an old, familiar unease. In his drawer inside the office was a faded photograph of a younger man standing beside an injured lioness, a veterinarian, kneeling at her side. It had been taken almost 30 years earlier, on a day when Sam had held an IV line in trembling fingers, while the vet removed a poacher's bullet lodged near her spine. They had saved her, but one cub had died from starvation before they could find the den. The memory still tasted bittersweet. He had learned long ago that in this work, you never got to save them all. But you tried anyway. He turned the key, and the Land Cruiser coughed to life. As he drove out through the open gate, the tires sent small fans of water spraying from the puddles. The reserve unfurled in front of him, a patchwork of grasslands and shrubs, flooded depressions reflecting the sky, and dark green lines of trees marking dry riverbeds now swollen and muddy. The air was rich with bird song and the distant grunt of hippos who had ventured out of the water to graze during the night and were now reluctantly returning to the safety of their pools. The route to the eastern ridge was slower than usual. Fallen branches littered the track. He had to skirt one completely uprooted tree, its shallow root system exposed like the underside of some giant dead spider. He could see new animal tracks printed in the soft mud: hyena, impala, zebra, and fresher still, the deep rounded impressions of a lion's paws. As he crested the last rise before the old Marula, he cut the engine and let the Land Cruiser roll to a stop, the crunch of wet gravel under the tires fading into quiet. Ordinarily, he would have heard the chattering of birds in the Marula's branches, the rustle of leaves. This morning, he heard only the distant rush of a swollen stream and the faint buzz of insects. The Marula itself lay at an angle. Its massive trunk snapped halfway up, its top section crashed to the ground. A fan of broken branches spread out like a fallen crown. The smell of crushed bark and sap was sharp and sweet. At first, he saw nothing else, just the broken tree, the soaked earth, and the bruised sky. Then he heard it. A low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan, coming from the far side of the trunk. It rose, trembled, and broke off into a harsh, panting breath. Sam's muscles tensed. He slid out of the vehicle slowly, leaving the door open in case he needed to retreat quickly. Every sense sharpened, the way they always did when danger and purpose collided. He moved around the fallen Marula at an angle, careful to keep his footsteps as quiet as the wet ground would allow. As he rounded the trunk, the scene in front of him locked his body in place. A fully grown male lion lay half-pinned beneath one of the enormous branches, his hindquarters trapped under its weight. His forelegs were free, claws dug into the mud where he had tried and failed to pull himself out. His mane, soaked and matted with mud and leaves, clung to his neck and shoulders in dark clumps. His sides heaved with ragged breaths. His lips were peeled back in a silent snarl, more from pain than threat. But it wasn't just any lion. Even caked in mud and flattened by exhaustion, Sam recognized him instantly. The broad forehead, the distinctive notch in the right ear, the darker streak of mane along the spine. Nkosi, the chief. For a second, Sam could only stare, the shock washing through him in a cold wave. In all his years, he had seen lions injured by snares, by fights, by bullets, but never like this, never pinned by the very land that had always carried them. Nkosi turned his head slowly, as if each movement sent pain through his body. His eyes met Sam's. They were not wild and rolling, not mindless with panic. They burned with a clear, focused intensity, and something Sam seldom allowed himself to name when it came to wild animals: comprehension. The lion's mouth opened slightly, a low, rumbling sound emerging. A warning, yes, but thin, strained, like the echo of what it would normally be. Sam lifted his hands slowly, palms out, showing he held nothing threatening. "I see you," he murmured, his voice quiet, but steady. "I see you, old man." The wind shifted, carrying the lion's scent to him: wet fur, blood, the sour tang of stress. Beneath that, the familiar, musky smell of lion he had known since his early days tracking them as a young ranger, when his beard had only just begun to grow and his heart still raced at every roar. He took a slow breath and forced his brain to start working. The branch had to weigh hundreds of kilos. There was no way Nkosi could free himself without help, Not in his condition, not with the ground this soft and unstable. Left like this, he would die, slowly, from internal injuries, dehydration, or the hyenas who would come when they realized this king could not rise. Sam felt something harden inside him, a decision taking root before he even consciously made it. "Base, this is Sam," he said into his radio, keeping his voice low. "I've got Nkosi trapped under a fallen marula on the eastern ridge. He's alive but pinned. I'm going to need assistance and possibly a jack from the workshop, and get the vet on standby." Static hissed, then the duty ranger's voice came back high with alarm. "You're with Nkosi? Sam, that lion—" "I'm aware who he is," Sam cut in gently. "Just send the help. And tell them to take the long route. The main track has a tree down." "Copy that. 15-20 minutes, came the reply, tinged with doubt. 20 minutes in a situation like this felt both too long and not long enough. Sam clipped the radio back onto his belt and looked at the massive branch trapping the lion. The trunk section was wedged at an angle between other limbs in the ground, its weight distributed unevenly. If he misjudged and shifted it the wrong way, it could come crashing down and crush Nkosi completely, or block any possibility of freeing him. He moved closer, just a step at a time, talking under his breath all the while. Not for the lion's understanding, but for his own rhythm, his own courage. "You remember me, don't you?" he murmured. "I'm the one who sat up all night by the river when you were just a shadow, roaring at the hippos, pretending nothing scared you." Nkosi's eyes tracked his movement, pupils wide in the gray light. A growl trembled in his chest as Sam came within a few meters, but it lacked force. There was more warning in his eyes than in the sound. Sam crouched down near the end of the branch that rested on the lion's back legs, careful not to make sudden movements. He could see now that the hindquarters were not crushed flat. The branch had landed awkwardly, catching the lion more in a pinch than a complete crush, though the skin around the hips was badly bruised and torn. Nkosi's tail tip twitched in pain. "You've got yourself into a hell of a mess," Sam said softly. "Storm didn't play fair last night, eh?" He pushed experimentally at the branch. It didn't budge. His aging muscles strained. His boots slipped slightly in. The mud and pain flickered up his spine. He stopped, breathing harder. Nkosi flinched, a short, rough snarl escaping him at the movement. "Easy, easy," Sam soothed, "just testing." The sound that came from deep in the lion's chest in response wasn't the full warning roar Sam expected. It was something else. A rumble with edges of pain, yes, but also tolerance. As long as the movement didn't worsen the agony, he would allow it. The realization stunned Sam more than he'd admit. He looked around, judging angles, weight, options. They needed leverage, they needed time, they needed calm. More than that, they needed trust, not the soft, sentimental kind, but the practical trust that kept a lion from lunging at the human who had decided to put his hands on a fallen tree just above his hind legs. "Help is coming," Sam told him, "but we're going to start without them, you and I." He went back to the vehicle, the hair prickling on his neck as he turned his back fully on the trapped lion, relying on instinct and the knowledge that Nkosi was too pinned, too exhausted to launch an attack even if he wanted to. From the back of the Land Cruiser, he pulled out the rope and a compact metal jack used for lifting vehicles out of ruts. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He trudged back through the mud, the jack feeling absurdly small in his hands compared to the size of the marula branch. Still, he had learned long ago that in the bush, you made tools out of what you had, not what you wished you had. Nkosi watched him return, nostrils flaring as he scented the unfamiliar metal, the oil, and the faint trace of gasoline on Sam's hands. Sam set the jack down near the base of the branch, at a point where the wood seemed less splintered and more solid. He started talking again, his voice a low murmur. "I'm going to lift, just a little," he said, as if explaining to the lion. "When I do, it's going to hurt, but then it won't. You understand?" It was ridiculous, of course, but as he slid the foot of the jack under the wood and began to slowly pump the handle, he could not shake the feeling that Nkosi was listening. The branch resisted at first, its weight sunk deep into the softened soil. The metal groaned softly under the load. Sam's arms burned. His breath came harsh and shallow. He ignored the protest from his joints and kept working the handle, inch by reluctant inch. Finally, the branch lifted a few centimeters. Mud sucked and released with a faint popping sound as some of the pressure came off the lion's hips. Nkosi snarled sharply, his hind legs twitching in reflex at the sudden change. Sam froze, muscles taut, ready to jump back if the lion twisted to bite, but Nkosi didn't. He dug his front claws deeper into the ground, breathing fast, riding out the pain. The eyes that locked on Sam were wide and bright, but they did not hold the wild, frenzied look of a cornered animal. They held a terrible, straining patience. Sam swallowed. "Just a little more," he whispered. He shifted, adjusted, pumped the jack again. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cool air. The branch rose higher, just enough that if Nkosi could gather his strength, he might be able to pull himself free. "Now," Sam breathed. "Now, my friend, try." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Nkosi bunched his forelegs, muscles rippling under mud-streaked fur, and pulled with everything he had left. His enormous body shuddered. The ground tore under his claws. A deep, guttural roar ripped out of him, not of anger, but of effort and searing pain. His hindquarters scraped along the mud, skin and fur tearing where they still gripped against the bark. The branch creaked, the jack shifted ominously. Sam pressed his shoulder against the base of the marula, adding his weight, the metal groaning in protest. "Come on," he gasped, uncertain whether he was urging the lion or himself. "Come on." With a final heave, Nkosi's hindquarters slid free, his body slumping forward onto the wet ground. The branch crashed down another centimeter, but the lion was clear. The jack, straining past its limit, buckled and toppled sideways, clanging against a rock. Sam stumbled back, suddenly released from the strain he'd been holding, and landed hard on one knee. Pain shot up his leg and into his hip. For a moment, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the thunder of his heartbeat in his ears. Then, the world rushed back in. Nkosi lay on his side, chest rising and falling in great shuddering breaths. His hind legs trembled and twitched, unused to being free from the crushing weight. Mud and blood streaked his flanks. He looked smaller, suddenly, less like a king and more like what he truly was, an animal made of muscle and vulnerability and bone, subject to the same cruel whims of weather and gravity as any other. Sam's hands shook as he pulled off his gloves. He could feel the beginnings of a deep ache blooming along his shoulders and spine. But he did not take his eyes off the lion. This was the most dangerous moment of all. Nkosi's head turned toward him, jaws parting. A sound emerged, hoarse, weak, but still undeniably a lion's growl. Sam held his ground, breathing hard, not moving closer, not backing away. He could see the calculation in the lion's eyes, the ancient instincts wrestling with the new reality. Pain, exhaustion, the lingering echo of the human's hands on the trapped branch, the freedom to move his legs again. Nkosi's lips closed slowly over his teeth. His eyes fluttered once, twice. Then his head dropped back to the ground. Sam realized he had been holding his breath and let it out in a long, trembling exhale. The sound of an engine reached his ears, faint at first, then growing louder. The backup team. He turned, limping slightly, and waved them down, signaling for them to stop well back, away from the immediate area. The vet, Dr. Nandi, climbed out of the truck, her dark hair pulled back in a hurried knot, eyes sharp. "You actually did it," she murmured when she saw the scene. "You freed him." Sam shrugged one shoulder, as if it were nothing more than an everyday chore, though his whole body screamed otherwise. "He did most of the work," he said. "I just convinced the tree to move its weight a little." They spoke in low voices, agreeing on the next steps. Nkosi's injuries needed to be assessed. If his spine or hips were damaged beyond repair, the most humane choice might be a difficult one. But from the way he had pulled himself out, there was hope. There was always hope, Sam believed, until there wasn't. Nandi prepared a tranquilizer dart. At this close range, they didn't need much sedative, only enough to keep the lion still while they checked for fractures and treated the worst of the wounds. Sam moved back toward the vehicle, giving her space and line of sight. She fired. The dart struck Nkosi high on the shoulder. The lion flinched, a snarling growl turning into a weary moan. Within minutes, his breathing slowed further, muscles slackening into a drugged heaviness. Only then did they approach fully. Together, kneeling in the mud, they worked over the old lion's body. Hands that had moved over countless wild creatures now pressed carefully along his spine, hips, and legs. No obvious breaks. The bruising and cuts were severe, but largely superficial. Internal injuries were still a question, but the fact that he could move his hindquarters at all was a good sign. They cleaned the worst of the gashes, applied antiseptic, injected a long-acting antibiotic. Through it all, Sam felt a strange, tender protectiveness wash over him. He remembered the first time he had seen Nkosi, just a lanky, half-grown male at the edge of someone else's territory, ribs showing, mane little more than a suggestion. He had thought then that one won't last. There are too many stronger males, too many rivals. But the young lion had surprised them all. Now, seeing him vulnerable again, Sam felt an odd sense of coming full circle. When they finished, they stepped back. "We'll let him sleep it off," Nandi said quietly. "Hopefully he'll be able to stand on his own when he wakes. If not, we'll reevaluate." Her voice trailed off. They both knew what that meant. Sam nodded but said nothing. They returned to the vehicles, giving the lion space, and waited as the gray sky brightened slowly toward late morning. The world around them resumed its normal rhythms, birds calling, insects ticking and buzzing, the distant lowing of cattle from out beyond the reserve's fence line. Time stretched. The sedative began to wear off. Sam watched as Nkosi's tail twitched, then his paws. His chest rose with deeper breaths. At last, with a low, groaning huff, the lion's eyes fluttered open. For several moments he lay still, blinking slowly, as if waking from a long, heavy dream. Then he tried to move. His forelegs pushed against the muddy ground. His hind legs quivered and slid, then found purchase. Sam's own muscles tensed in sympathy as he watched every tremor, every flinch. Inch by inch, the lion hauled himself up into a sitting position, panting, head low. His mane hung around him like a tattered cloak. He swayed, steadied, then, with another deep, determined breath, got his front paws under him and rose fully to his feet. Sam felt something in his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been clenching. The old king was standing again. Nkosi stood for a long time, simply breathing, blood and mud drying in dark streaks along his flanks. Then he turned his head and looked straight at Sam. Sam couldn't explain, even to himself, why he stepped closer then. Only a meter or two, still well out of swiping range, but closer than any rational person would choose to be to a newly awakened, injured adult male lion. Perhaps it was foolishness. Perhaps it was something else, a need to acknowledge the strange intimacy of what had just happened, to close the circle. Nkosi's amber eyes held his. In that moment, the roaring territorial king of the savannah was gone. In his place was a living being who had hurt, who had been helped, and who knew, in some wordless way, that the human in front of him had not caused his pain but had eased it. The lion's lips did not curl. His tail did not lash. He simply looked, deep and unblinking. Then he did something Sam would remember for the rest of his life. Nkosi dipped his head, just slightly, just once, before turning away. It was a small movement, so quickly done that anyone watching might have missed it or dismissed it as nothing more than the normal shift of a tired animal. But Sam saw it. He felt it. After that, the lion began to limp away, his steps uneven but determined, heading in the direction of the dry riverbed where the pride often lay up in the shade. Nandi exhaled. "He's going to be sore for weeks," she said. "But I think he'll make it." Sam nodded, watching the fading shape. "He's made it through worse," he murmured. When they were sure Nkosi was out of immediate danger, the vet team packed up and drove back toward the station, taking with them the broken jack and the lingering smell of antiseptic. Sam stayed behind. Part of him wanted to follow the lion at a distance to see where he went, but he knew better than to press too close on a day when the balance between gratitude and instinct might still be fragile. Instead, he walked to a nearby rise and stood there, hands on his hips, looking out over the land Nkosi had claimed so fiercely. The sky had shifted from storm, bruised to a softer blue, hints of sunlight breaking through the thinning clouds. A warm wind picked up, carrying with it 1,000 scents. wet grass, distant wildebeest, the faint musk of lions he could not yet see. He was about to turn back to the Land Cruiser when the wind carried something else to him. A roar. This one was not strained. It rolled across the land with full-bodied power, vibrating in his ribs. Nkosi, announcing himself to the world once more. Sam smiled despite himself. "Still got it," he muttered. He waited for a second roar and heard it, this time answered by others, higher, feminine voices. The pride. They were close, closer than he had thought. Something in him went still. Curiosity won out over caution. He found himself walking, not directly toward the sound, but along a slight curve, using the slope of the land and the scattered bushes as partial cover. He wanted to see if Nkosi made it back to his family. Nothing more, he told himself. Nothing more. He crested a small rise and froze. In the shallow dip beyond, less than 50 meters away, lay the pride sprawled out in the damp grass. Lionesses, their coats darkened slightly by lingering moisture. Subadult males and females, lanky and restless, jostling lightly against one another. Younger cubs, their spots still visible, rolling and batting at each other's ears. And there, on the edge, standing rather than lying, was Nkosi. His limp was still pronounced, but he stood tall, mane stirring in the breeze as the lionesses moved toward him, heads low, sniffing, licking at his wounds. They circled him with low, rumbling calls, reassurance and inquiry, all in one. One lioness, her eyes a lighter amber than the others, pressed her head firmly against his shoulder, rubbing her cheek along his battered mane. Sam watched, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. He should have turned back right then. He knew it. But he also knew that very few humans had ever seen what he was seeing now, the raw vulnerability of a lion who had looked death in the eye and returned to the only place that made sense, his family. Lost in that thought, he didn't notice at first when one of the younger lionesses lifted her head and stared directly at him. Her gaze sharpened, her ears pricked forward. Then another lioness looked his way, and another. In a matter of seconds, half a dozen lions were staring straight at him, their golden eyes lit with an intensity that made his skin tighten. Sam's fingers twitched toward the radio at his belt, then stopped. He knew calling for help would do little. 50 meters was no distance at all to a lion. They had almost certainly known he was there from the moment he crested the rise, perhaps even before. He stood very still, heart thudding. One of the lionesses began to walk toward him. Then another fell into step beside her. Then another. Within moments, the pride was moving in a loose formation, not at a charge, but at a steady, purposeful pace, closing the distance. Nkosi stayed where he was, watching, not stopping them, not urging them on, simply watching. Sam's mouth went dry. He considered backing away slowly, but rejected the idea. If he turned, he might trigger a chase instinct. If he ran, he wouldn't make it 3 strides. So he did the only thing that felt right. He stood his ground, planted his boots in the wet soil, and kept his hands visible and relaxed by his sides. His breath came slow and measured, though everything inside him was screaming. The pride fanned out as they approached. Within seconds, they were all around him, lionesses behind, beside, in front. Their bodies formed a loose circle, tails flicking, paws silent on the softened earth. He could smell them, musky, wild, sun-warm, despite the cool day, with a faint metallic undertone of blood still clinging to a few mouths from an early morning kill. One young lioness came close enough that he could see the tiny scars along her nose, the delicate whisker spots above her mouth. She lowered her head, nostrils flaring as she drew in his scent. Another moved behind him, so close he could feel the air shift against the back of his legs as she exhaled. Sam's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He resisted every urge to turn, to track each lion with his eyes. Movement would only stir them more. So he chose a point just above the nearest lioness's head and focused his gaze softly there, seeing enough to react if he needed to, not enough to challenge. There was no growling, no snarling, no rush of bodies pressing in to knock him off his feet. There was only the quiet sound of breathing, the soft rustle of fur as they shifted, the occasional huff as one exhaled more sharply. They were not attacking. They were smelling him, studying him, passing around something they already half knew. He realized with a jolt what that something was. He carried Nkosi's scent on him. The lion's blood, sweat, and fur clung faintly to his clothes from where he had leaned against the branch, from where his gloved hands had brushed the old male's mane as they worked. The lionesses moved like a living current around him. One brushed against his thigh lightly, and his whole leg went numb with electric fear. Another's tail curled briefly around his calf before flicking away. A young male, his mane only just beginning to grow, stepped closer than the rest. He lifted his head, eyes bright with that reckless curiosity only youth possessed, and stared straight into Sam's face. For a moment, man and lion regarded each other in the gray light of post-storm morning, the distance between them no more than a breath. Sam saw no hatred there, no hunger, only a question. Who are you that our king smells like you, and the tree no longer holds him down? Sam's throat felt too tight to speak, but the words formed anyway, barely audible. Just a tired old man, he whispered, who wasn't ready to see him go. Behind the circling bodies, Nkosi watched. At one point, he limped forward a few steps, head high, gaze intent. He made a low, almost conversational rumble deep in his chest. Several of the lionesses flicked their ears and glanced his way. The circle's tension changed. Sam couldn't have explained it, but he felt it, something loosening, something deciding. One by one, the lionesses began to move away, drifting back toward Nkosi, toward the comfortable depression in the earth where they had lain earlier. The circle around him broke as quietly as it had formed. The young male lingered a heartbeat longer, nostrils flaring one last time in Sam's direction, then turned and padded back to the pride, his tail tip curling lazily. Within moments, Sam was alone on the rise, the lions once again shapes in the shallow dip beyond him, settling down, grooming, yawning, resuming the slow royal rhythm of their day. Only Nkosi remained standing for a moment longer, his amber eyes fixed on Sam. Then he too lay down with a heavy sigh, one paw draped over his bruised, aching hips, his great head resting on the damp ground. The wind shifted. The scent of lions drifted away, replaced by the green smell of wet grass and the distant sweetness of blooming wildflowers that had been waiting for rain. Sam realized his hands were shaking. He laughed once, a short, incredulous sound, more breath than voice. "You nearly gave me a heart attack," he muttered, though whether he meant the pride or his own racing heart, he wasn't sure. As he walked slowly back to the land cruiser, every step suddenly heavy, he felt strangely light inside. He had been surrounded by lions, truly surrounded, close enough to touch, close enough to be gone from this world in a flurry of claws and teeth, and he had walked away. More than that, he had stood quietly at the center of their circle and felt for a fleeting moment not like prey, not like a threat, but like something else entirely. Days turned into weeks. Nkosi's limp improved slowly. The bruising faded. The scars remained. He returned to his routines, patrolling his territory, roaring at dusk and dawn, watching over his pride from the shade of thorn trees and termite mounds warmed by the sun. Whenever Sam saw him after that, there was always a heartbeat, a single breath where the lion's gaze would linger on him, a fraction longer than seemed necessary, as if flipping through the pages of an old memory. The younger rangers asked Sam to tell the story again and again, leaning forward with wide eyes as he described the fallen tree, the jack, the circle of lions. They laughed nervously at the idea of being surrounded that way, shivered when he told them how close the young male had come. They called him crazy and brave in equal measure. Sam only shook his head. It wasn't bravery, he'd say quietly. It was just what needed to be done. But alone, on quiet evenings when the sky turned molten gold and the air cooled enough for the night sounds to begin, he would sit on the veranda with another mug of tea and let the memory wash over him more fully. The weight of the branch against his shoulder, the strain in his arms, the feeling of the lion's body finally pulling free. The way Nkosi's head had dipped barely before turning away. The circle of lions around him, the gentle brush of fur against his leg, the steady breath of a young lion on his face as they examined him like a piece of some larger, unexpected puzzle that had touched all their lives. Years later, when his joints had stiffened enough that his patrols were shorter and his radio stayed mostly on the table instead of clipped to his belt, there were mornings when he would wake before dawn to the sound of a roar rolling in from the distance. Sometimes it was Nkosi, older now, voice roughened by time but still strong. Sometimes it was another male, younger, the next chapter in a story that never really ended, only changed hands. On those mornings, Sam would step out onto the veranda, lean against the rail, and look out at the subtle glow of the waking bush. He would breathe in deep and feel, not above or outside this wild world, but woven into it in a quiet, invisible way. A man who once leaned his aging weight against a fallen tree to give a lion a second chance. A man who had stood in the center of a pride and learned that sometimes, in the rarest of moments, fear and trust can share the same small space in a beating heart. Somewhere out there, he liked to imagine, lions moved through the grass with no thought of storms or jacks or old rangers. But maybe, just maybe, on some cool evening when the wind was right, an aging lion with a faint limp in his back leg would lift his head, catch a familiar scent on the air, the ghost of rooibos and engine oil and human sweat, and remember, in the mysterious, powerful way animals sometimes do, the day the tree did not get to keep him. And for Sam, that quiet possibility was enough. It was proof that kindness, once given without demand, did not just fall away like rain on hard ground. It soaked in, it left roots. It lived on in scars and in stories, in roars carried on the wind, and in the eyes of a man who, for a few trembling minutes, had been accepted inside a circle of lions and walked back out again with his soul forever changed.